Everything is Fcked is one of those titles that sounds like a joke until you sit with it for a moment and realize it is trying to name a real mood. Not just a passing frustration, but a cultural atmosphere. A feeling that things are unstable, absurd, manipulated, polarized, and somehow emotionally exhausting even when many parts of modern life are materially easier than life once was. Mark Manson uses that mood as the starting point for a deeper question. Why do so many people feel hopeless in a world that appears, by many objective standards, to be more advanced, more comfortable, and more full of opportunity than previous ages? This book is his attempt to answer that question. It is not a soft or sentimental book. It is not built to reassure the reader with shallow positivity. It is a philosophical and psychological exploration of hope, belief, emotion, suffering, freedom, and meaning. It tries to explain why comfort does not automatically create peace, why intelligence does not guarantee wisdom, why freedom can become destabilizing, and why modern people often seem spiritually disoriented despite living amid enormous material progress. In this sense, the book is more ambitious than its irreverent style first suggests. It is not merely commenting on self-help or modern anxiety. It is trying to understand the conditions under which hope becomes possible or impossible. As we move through this summary, we will explore the major forces Manson is wrestling with, the limits of rationality, the hidden power of emotion, the inevitability of pain, the hunger for belief, the fragility of modern freedom, and the challenge of building meaning without collapsing into naive optimism or cynical despair. Beneath the profanity is a serious question. If the world feels broken, how does a person remain oriented, sane, and hopeful inside it? One of the book's foundational observations is the paradox of modern life. Human beings today often live with comforts, protections, technologies, and opportunities that earlier generations could barely imagine. Yet many people do not feel deeply secure or hopeful. Instead, they feel overwhelmed, alienated, restless, and emotionally frayed. This paradox matters because it disrupts a common modern assumption that material progress naturally produces psychological progress. Manson challenges that assumption. He suggests that abundance can coexist with despair. In fact, in some ways abundance can intensify despair by multiplying choices, deepening comparison, and weakening the structures that once organized people's sense of meaning. The book therefore begins by questioning the equation between external advancement and inner well-being. A world can improve in many measurable ways while still leaving people confused about why they are here, what they should value, and how to interpret suffering. This is a profound shift in emphasis. Many forms of modern discourse focus on solving technical problems. More wealth, better health systems, improved communication, greater efficiency, wider access, more convenience. These things matter. But they do not automatically answer the more difficult human questions. What is worth living for? What should one believe in? What gives pain meaning? What makes freedom tolerable? Why do people still feel empty when many of their surface needs are met? Manson's broader claim is that the modern crisis is not only practical or political. It is existential. It has to do with the structures of hope that people live by. When those structures weaken, comfort alone cannot compensate. People begin to drift. They become vulnerable to anxiety, extremism, emotional manipulation, or empty forms of stimulation. This is one reason the book feels larger than a typical self-help title. It is not only asking how individuals can feel better. It is asking what sort of psychological and moral conditions allow a civilization full of successful systems to still produce a population haunted by hopelessness. A major thread running through everything is Fcked is the distinction between reason and emotion. Manson argues that people like to imagine themselves as rational actors who make decisions through conscious thought, but this self-image is often misleading. Beneath the surface, much of human life is driven by emotional systems that operate first and think later. The rational mind is important, but it is not the true sovereign people often pretend it is. This idea has enormous consequences for how the book understands modern life. If emotion is primary in many human decisions, then no amount of abstract logic will fully explain why people believe what they believe, desire what they desire, or react the way they do. Fear, insecurity, status anxiety, longing, belonging, resentment, and emotional hunger all shape thought long before thought begins offering explanations. In other words, rationality often arrives as a narrator rather than a master. This is a humbling claim. It means self-control is not as straightforward as people imagine. It means persuasion is rarely about facts alone. It means people are more vulnerable to emotional economies than they would like to admit. Manson uses this insight to complicate simplistic stories about choice and freedom. If emotion quietly governs so much of human behavior, then a person must become more honest about their internal life. They must ask not only what they think, but what they're emotionally organized around. What do they fear? What do they crave? What kind of validation are they seeking? What private pain is making them susceptible to certain narratives? This is one of the most valuable aspects of the book because it keeps the conversation from becoming moralistic. Rather than simply telling readers to think better, it pushes them to understand the deeper machinery of why thinking so often serves emotional need. That awareness becomes a first step toward wisdom. Not total mastery, perhaps, but greater humility and greater realism about the self. From this distinction between thought and feeling, Manson moves into a challenging idea. Self-control is often much less complete than people assume. This does not mean that discipline is impossible. It means that human beings are not transparent to themselves. They are influenced by desires, impulses, narratives, habits, and emotional reflexes that operate with more force than the conscious mind likes to admit. This matters because modern culture often treats freedom as if it were purely liberating. More options, more autonomy, more choice, more self-definition. But if people are inwardly unstable, more freedom can become more confusion. Instead of producing peace, it can produce paralysis, distraction, vanity, and the constant pressure to invent meaning without guidance. Manson's critique is not anti-freedom. It is anti-naivete about freedom. He suggests that freedom without structure can become emotionally overwhelming. Human beings seem to need orientation, values, limits, and commitments in order for freedom to feel livable. Otherwise, the endless field of possibility turns into an endless field of comparison and self-doubt. This is one of the book's most provocative implications. It suggests that some modern despair comes not only from oppression or deprivation, but from the psychological strain of radical openness without enough moral and emotional grounding. A person can be surrounded by options and still feel lost. A person can have enormous latitude and still not know what to care about. This is why hope, in Manson's framework, requires more than opportunity. It requires forms of meaning sturdy enough to stabilize the self. The title of the book announces despair, but the subtitle announces its real topic, hope. For Manson, hope is not the same as cheerfulness, confidence, or the belief that everything will work out. Hope is deeper and more serious. It is the conviction that suffering can still be connected to something meaningful. It is the sense that pain, limitation, and uncertainty do not empty life of value. This is a crucial distinction because many modern people associate hope with positivity, and when positivity becomes implausible, they fall into cynicism. Manson wants a stronger version of hope than that. A hope that survives contact with chaos. A hope that does not depend on denial. A hope that can endure disappointment without dissolving. This is why the book spends so much time examining the emotional and philosophical conditions under which hope is either built or destroyed. If a person believes only in comfort, then pain will destroy hope. If a person believes only in control, then uncertainty will destroy hope. If a person believes only in success, then failure will destroy hope. But if a person grounds hope in meaning, responsibility, and values that remain intact even under strain, then hope becomes harder to extinguish. In this sense, hope is less a feeling than a structure. It is built from what a person believes life is for, what they think pain means, and what kind of commitments they are willing to remain faithful to. Manson is ultimately arguing that hope must be earned intellectually and emotionally. It must be built on truths strong enough to survive the collapse of fantasy. One of the book's clearest and most sobering lessons is that pain is universal. No human life escapes it. The forms vary, but the fact remains. Loss, disappointment, limitation, confusion, betrayal, aging, mortality, loneliness, fear, humiliation, effort, grief. These are not glitches in the system. They are part of the system. Manson insists on this because modern culture often teaches the opposite indirectly. It implies that pain is a sign of malfunction, that enough optimization will eliminate distress, or that emotional discomfort means one has failed to arrange life correctly. Manson rejects all of that. Pain is not evidence that life is broken. Pain is part of the human condition. The real question is not how to avoid all pain, but how to understand and organize it. This shifts the moral center of the book. Instead of promising relief from suffering, it asks what makes suffering worth enduring. Pain for vanity is one thing. Pain for love is another. Pain for status is one thing. Pain for truth, loyalty, creation, service, or responsibility is another. Once pain is seen as unavoidable, values become decisive. They determine whether pain feels empty or meaningful. This is one reason the book becomes unexpectedly moral. It is not content with simply describing despair. It wants to know what kinds of belief and commitment can make pain bearable without lying about its reality. For the listener, this can be deeply clarifying. Much anxiety comes from treating discomfort as an emergency. But if discomfort is normal, then emotional life can become less panicked. One can stop asking, how do I eliminate all pain, and start asking, what is this pain attached to, and is that attachment worthy of me? A particularly modern aspect of the book is its interest in what might be called the feelings economy. Manson seems deeply aware that modern life does not just contain emotions. It trades in them. Media, politics, advertising, social platforms, public discourse, and cultural institutions all compete to provoke reaction, capture attention, and organize identity through emotional intensity. In such an environment, outrage, fear, belonging, shame, envy, and moral certainty become commodities. This makes hope more fragile because the inner life is constantly being pulled outward and manipulated. A person loses the ability to distinguish what genuinely deserves care from what merely demands reaction. The result is exhaustion, tribalism, and emotional fragmentation. This is one of the book's most contemporary insights. Modern despair is not only about what people believe. It is also about what repeatedly captures their nervous system. If a person's attention is continuously monetized or politicized, then stable hope becomes harder to sustain. They begin living in cycles of stimulus and reaction rather than reflection and commitment. Manson's broader warning here is that psychological freedom requires some discipline of attention. A person must learn not only what to think, but what to feed emotionally. Otherwise, their sense of reality becomes shaped by the loudest and most manipulative forces around them. Another major ambition of Everything is Fcked is to explore the relationship between belief systems and hope. Manson appears interested in the ways religion and politics begin to resemble one another when they are used to satisfy deep human needs for certainty, belonging, transcendence, and moral drama. The implication is not simply that religion is political or politics is religious. It is that human beings are creatures who orient themselves around ultimate concerns, whether they admit it or not. They need something to revere, something to obey, something to build identity around, something that makes suffering make sense. When traditional sources of meaning weaken, these needs do not vanish. They migrate. They attach themselves to ideology, tribal identity, status systems, consumer culture, celebrity, nationalism, outrage, or even personal branding. Manson's concern seems to be that many modern substitutes for meaning are too shallow or unstable to carry the weight people place on them. They generate emotional fervor without producing wisdom. They create certainty without humility. They mobilize identity without cultivating depth. This is one reason the book feels philosophically restless. It is searching for a form of hope that does not collapse into fanaticism, naivete, or nihilism. For the reader, this section invites an uncomfortable but important question. What am I really serving? What have I granted sacred status in my life? Approval? Political certainty? Pleasure? Security? Achievement? Moral superiority? Some hidden promise that if I secure it, I will finally be okay? Manson's deeper point is that hope depends partly on whether what we worship is actually worthy of our worship. One of the hardest challenges the book confronts is how to preserve meaning without becoming naive. Many modern readers are suspicious of grand narratives, suspicious of institutions, suspicious of certainty, suspicious of easy moral language, and often suspicious of themselves. That suspicion can be healthy, but it can also become corrosive. When everything is deconstructed, mocked, or distrusted, it becomes harder to commit to anything deeply. Cynicism then begins to masquerade as intelligence. Manson pushes against this. He seems to argue that irony and detachment are not enough to build a life. At some point, a person must still choose. They must still love, still believe, still work, still take responsibility, still endure, still care. Meaning requires investment. It requires vulnerability to disappointment. It requires risking commitment in a world where certainty is unavailable. This may be one of the most important lessons in the book. Hope is not found by floating above life in permanent skepticism. It is found by engaging with life honestly enough to know its flaws and still choosing worthwhile commitments anyway. That is a mature hope. Not blind. Not sentimental. But durable because it has passed through disillusionment and not surrendered to it. For all its philosophy, Everything is Fcked also offers practical lessons. First, do not equate material comfort with inner stability. A comfortable environment can still produce a confused and unhappy mind. Second, become more honest about the emotional forces shaping your behavior. Rational explanations are often incomplete. Third, treat pain as inevitable and ask what makes it meaningful rather than asking how to erase it entirely. Fourth, protect your attention. Much of modern hopelessness is intensified by living in reactive emotional cycles created by systems that profit from agitation. Fifth, examine what you truly believe in. Human beings always end up devoting themselves to something, so the question is whether that something is deep enough to support a life. Sixth, resist both empty optimism and fashionable despair. Neither one is a strong enough basis for adulthood. The stronger path is sober hope, the ability to face disorder honestly while still choosing meaning, responsibility, and commitment. These lessons can be applied quietly in ordinary life. In the media you consume. In the values you reinforce. In the way you handle suffering. In the kinds of communities you trust. In the standards by which you judge success. The book's usefulness lies here. It does not hand over a formula. It sharpens a set of questions that can reorganize how a person lives. Everything is Fcked endures because it speaks to a mood many people recognize but cannot easily name. A sense that progress has not cured confusion. That comfort has not guaranteed peace. That information has not guaranteed wisdom. That freedom has not guaranteed meaning. Mark Manson's response is not to deny these problems or to cover them with cheerful language. It is to ask what kind of hope can remain after illusion has been stripped away. The answer he seems to offer is demanding. Hope must be built on a more truthful understanding of human nature. It must acknowledge that emotion often rules more than reason, that pain is inescapable, that attention is vulnerable to manipulation, and that human beings cannot live without devotion to something larger than impulse. But the answer is also humane. Even in a fractured world, meaning remains possible. Even in a manipulated culture, attention can be reclaimed. Even in pain, a person can choose what is worth suffering for. Even without certainty, one can commit. And even when everything feels broken, the self does not have to become broken in the same way. That is the final gift of the book. Not optimism, but orientation. Not fantasy, but a harder and more durable kind of hope.